The soft scratching against my bedroom window at 3 a.m. seemed innocent at first. Tap, 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 like tree branches in the wind. But there are no trees outside my third-floor apartment. I froze under my covers, breath caught in my throat, as the tapping turned into slow, deliberate dragging sounds. 5 distinct scratches, moving from left to right, as if someone or something was drawing fingers across the glass. I've been living in this small apartment on the edge of Long Beach for about 8 months now. It's nothing special, just a one-bedroom with faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards in a building that seemed better days. The rent was cheap, which was all that mattered when I moved here after landing my first real job at a local recording studio. Working with up-and-coming artists and helping them produce their tracks had always been my dream. And despite the long hours and modest pay, I was finally living it up. My apartment is on the top floor of an old Victorian house that's been converted into separate units. The building sits at the end of a quiet street, bordered by an overgrown lot on one side and an abandoned warehouse on the other. My neighbors keep to themselves, which suits me fine. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, lives on the first floor, an elderly man with cloudy eyes who shuffles around muttering to himself, and only seems to appear when rent is due. The first few months were uneventful. I'd come home late from the studio, eat up some ramen, maybe smoke a little to unwind, and fall asleep to the distant sound of sirens and the occasional dog barking. Nothing out of the ordinary. But about 2 weeks ago, things started to change. It began with the smell, a pungent, earthy odor that would waft through my apartment at odd hours, like soil and something rotting underneath. I checked my fridge, took out the trash, even crawled around looking for dead mice, but found nothing. Then came the sounds. At first, just subtle creaks and groans that I attributed to the old building settling. But they seemed to follow a pattern, always starting around 3 a.m. and lasting for exactly 17 minutes. I know because I started timing them. Footsteps that paced back and forth in the hallway outside my door. But when I'd peek out, there was never anyone there. The sound of muffled conversations coming through my walls, despite knowing the adjacent apartment had been vacant for months. And now, the scratching at my window. I lay perfectly still that first night, barely breathing, my heart hammering against my ribs. After what felt like hours, I finally gathered enough courage to slowly sit up and look toward the window. The scratching had stopped, but the curtains were parted slightly. Had I left them that way? Through the gap, I could see nothing but darkness. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was looking back at me. The next day at work, I was a mess. Dark circles under my eyes, jumping at every sound in the studio. My boss, Marcus, noticed immediately and pulled me aside. "Rough night?" he asked, eyebrow raised. I laughed it off, blaming it on a new mix I was working on. But as I sat there adjusting levels on a track, my mind kept drifting back to those 5 distinct scratches. By the time I headed home that evening, a heavy fog had settled over the city, turning the streetlights into hazy orbs that did little to illuminate my path. The usual 20-minute walk from the bus stop to my apartment felt longer. The shadows between buildings deeper. When I finally reached my building, I noticed something odd. The front door, which is always locked, stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, calling out for Mr. Peterson, but received no answer. The hallway was darker than usual. 2 of the 4 bulbs had burned out, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. As I made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Reaching my floor, I fumbled for my keys, eager to get inside, and locked the door behind me. But as I approached my apartment, I stopped cold. My door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it that morning. Heart racing, I pushed it open slowly, fumbling for the light switch. As the room illuminated, I let out a sigh of relief. Everything looked normal. Maybe I had been in a rush and forgotten to lock up. It wouldn't be the first time. I went through my usual routine microwave dinner, scrolled through social media, tried to lose myself in a new Netflix series. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift to the window, expecting to see something there. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The dream came immediately. I was standing in a vast field of tall grass, the moon huge and yellow above me. In the distance, a figure moved between the stalks, too fast to be human. It paused occasionally, and even from afar, I could feel its eyes on me. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The figure drew closer, moving in that unnatural, jerky way. Just as it was about to break through the grass line, a loud thud jolted me awake. I sat up gasping, drenched in sweat. The clock on my nightstand read 3:02 a.m. That's when I heard it again, a thud, followed by slow, dragging sounds. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from directly above me, from the ceiling, which made no sense. I lived on the top floor. There was nothing above me but the roof. I sat frozen, listening as the sounds continued. Thud, drag, thud, drag, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Then came a new sound, a low, rhythmic humming. Not mechanical, but not quite human either. It reminded me of the bassline loops we used in the studio, but distorted, wrong somehow. Gathering my courage, I reached for my phone to call Marcus. Or maybe even 911, but found the screen completely black. Dead battery? No, I had charged it before bed. I tried the bedside lamp. Nothing. The power was out. In the darkness. The humming grew louder, now accompanied by what sounded like words in a language I couldn't understand. Deep guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. The thuds and drags continued their steady rhythm, now seeming to move in a circular pattern above me. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noises. I strained my ears, waiting for something, anything. Minutes passed. Just as my racing heart began to slow, I heard a new sound, soft at first, then growing louder. A scratching directly above my bed. 5 distinct scratches, moving slowly from left to right. Plaster dust began to drift down from the ceiling, landing on my face and my eyes. I wanted to move, to run from the room, but my body wouldn't respond. The scratching continued, more insistent now, and to my horror, I could see the ceiling beginning to bulge downward, as if something was pressing against it from above. A crack appeared, small at first, then spreading like a spider's web across the ceiling. More dust rained down, and with it, drops of something dark and viscous. When it hit my cheek, it was warm. I finally broke free from my paralysis and scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door, unable to tear my eyes away from the ceiling. The crack widened, and I could now see something moving in the darkness beyond. Fingers long, spindly, and too numerous to count, began to push through the opening, curling downward into my room. They were followed by what I first thought was hair-thick, matted clumps of it. But as more pushed through, I realized with mounting horror that they were roots. Plant roots intertwined with what looked like human hair. I finally turned and ran, yanking open my bedroom door and stumbling into the hallway. But instead of my living room, I found myself in a long, unfamiliar corridor. The walls were covered in the same faded wallpaper as my apartment, but the hallway stretched impossibly far in both directions, lined with identical doors. This wasn't my apartment anymore. This wasn't even my building. Behind me, I could hear the ceiling in my bedroom finally giving way with a sickening crack, followed by the wet sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then footsteps, slow, uneven, moving toward the open door. I ran. The corridor seemed to stretch and contract as I moved, doors blurring past me. I tried several handles, but each door was locked. The footsteps behind me quickened, accompanied now by that same low humming dot at the end of the hallway. I finally found a door that opened. I threw myself through it and slammed it shut, fumbling for a lock that wasn't there. I found myself in a small, windowless room with bare concrete walls. The only feature was an old tape recorder sitting on a wooden stool in the center of the room. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I backed away, eyes fixed on the handle, waiting for it to turn. Instead, the humming returned, now clearly right outside the door. It had a pattern to it, almost like words. Like someone trying to communicate. My attention turned to the tape recorder. It looked ancient, the kind we kept as vintage pieces at the studio. To my surprise, it was running, the spools turning slowly. I approached it cautiously, bent down, and pressed play. My own voice filled the room, but it was speaking words I had never said, describing things I had never seen. It described in perfect detail the scratching at my window from the night before, the figure in my dream, the ceiling collapsing. It was describing everything that had happened to me as if it had been recorded beforehand. Then my voice on the tape changed, becoming deeper, distorted. The roots go deep here. They remember what happened in the studio. They remember what was buried, what you found and didn't report, the evidence you destroyed, the tracks you erased. Did you think music was just sound? Some frequencies open doors, some rhythms are keys, and now something is coming through. The tape continued, but I couldn't make out the words anymore. They dissolved into that same rhythmic humming I'd been hearing. As the humming from the tape synchronized perfectly with the humming outside the door, the handle slowly began to turn. Backing into the corner, I watched as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But something was there, in the shadows, moving. The humming grew louder, surrounding me, penetrating me. And from the darkness, those same root-like tendrils began to snake into the room, reaching toward me, bringing with them that earthly, rotting smell I'd noticed weeks ago. As they drew closer, I noticed something tangled among them, small objects, catching what little light there was in the room. I squinted, trying to make them out. They were USB drives, dozens of them, wrapped and suspended in the mass of roots and hair, each labeled with names I recognized, artists who had come through our studio, whose tracks I had worked on, whose music had contained those strange frequencies Marcus insisted we include in the final mixes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Whatever was happening, whatever was coming through my ceiling and stalking me through impossible hallways, it was connected to the studio, to the music, to what we had been embedding into those tracks all along. The tendrils reached the tape recorder, wrapping around it lovingly, almost reverently. My recorded voice continued, now barely audible beneath the humming. Listen closely now. The next track is about to begin. And this time, you're not the producer. You're the instrument. The massive roots surged forward suddenly, and I pressed myself against the wall, searching desperately for an escape that wasn't there. As the first tendril touched my ankle, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my leg. My mouth opened in a silent scream as more tendrils wrapped around my limbs, my torso, my neck. They were warm and pulsing, like living things, and I could feel them tightening, pulling me toward the doorway and the darkness beyond. The humming had become a full melody now, hauntingly familiar. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was the bass line from the track I had been working on just yesterday, but altered, corrupted somehow. As I was dragged inch by inch toward the darkness, the tape recorder emitted one final message in my own distorted voice. Welcome to the new label. The contract is binding, and the session ... is just beginning. Something shifted in the darkness of the doorway. Something massive was moving toward me, obscured but unmistakably there. I caught a glimpse of glistening teeth, too many and too sharp, arranged in concentric circles within what might have been a face. Above them, countless eyes blinked in unison, each one reflecting my own terrified expression back at me. The last thing I felt before being pulled completely into the darkness was the gentle touch of 5 distinct fingers dragging across my cheek, exactly like the scratching on my window. And as consciousness began to fade, I realized with perfect clarity what the humming had been trying to tell me all along. In the language of root and rhythm, soil and sound, it had been repeating the same phrase. Is it a crime to steal someone's soul if you immortalize it in a track? Is it a crime if they never know they've signed away more than just royalties? Is it a crime if they volunteered? The darkness swallowed me whole, and somewhere, on a streaming service unknown, a new track began to play. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When awareness slowly returned, I found myself lying on a cold concrete floor, my clothes damp with condensation. My head throbbed, and when I tried to move, every muscle screamed in protest. Opening my eyes, I discovered I was in what appeared to be a basement, a large industrial space with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and walls of bare cinder blocks. The only light came from a single bulb swinging gently from a wire, creating moving shadows that made the room seem alive. With considerable effort, I managed to sit up and take in my surroundings. The space was mostly empty, except for stacks of old recording equipment pushed against one wall, mixing boards, speakers, microphones on stands, all covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a peculiar arrangement of objects. 7 tape recorders positioned in a perfect circle, each connected to the next by what looked like thin, organic filaments, those same root-like tendrils I had seen before, but smaller, more delicate. I tried to stand, but discovered my ankle was secured to a pipe with what I first thought was rope. Looking closer, I realized with a surge of revulsion that it was another mass of those living roots, pulsing slightly with what seemed like a heartbeat. They weren't tight enough to cut off circulation, but they held firm when I pulled against them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came a voice from the shadows. "They don't like it when you struggle. Makes them agitated." I squinted into the darkness beyond the swinging light. "Marcus?" I called, recognizing my boss's voice. "What the hell is going on? Where are we?" Marcus stepped into the light, and I had to stifle a gasp. He looked terrible gaunt, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes. His normally well-kept appearance was gone, replaced by several days' worth of stubble and disheveled clothes. But what disturbed me most was his smile too. Wide, too eager. There was something wrong about it. Like his face was a mask worn by something that didn't quite understand how human expressions worked. "We're underneath the studio," he explained calmly, as if this were a normal conversation. The old recording space from before the building was renovated. Most people don't know it exists. The original owner sealed it off after what happened in '76. He began pacing slowly around the circle of tape recorders, occasionally adjusting knobs or checking connections. The tendrils moved slightly when he touched them, almost affectionately. "What happened in '76? I asked, trying to keep him talking while I discreetly worked at the roots binding my ankle. Marcus chuckled. "A recording session that went wrong, or very right, depending on your perspective. A band was experimenting with something they shouldn't have been. Frequencies that weren't meant to be heard. Rhythms that weren't meant to be played." He paused, running a hand lovingly over one of the recorders. They opened the door without realizing it. "Let something through." I remembered the distorted voice. On the tape, some frequencies open doors. Some rhythms are keys. You've been doing the same thing, I realized aloud. Those special mixes you've had me working on. The weird bassline frequencies you insist on including in every track. You've been what? Trying to recreate what happened. Marcus's face lit up like I just solved a difficult puzzle. Not recreate, continue. Perfect. After what happened to that band, after they were all found with their vocal cords ripped out, their eardrums punctured from the inside, everyone thought it was some kind of cult killing. The studio was shut down. This level sealed off. But I found the original tapes. I heard it, the voice coming through the music. He gestured expansively around us. It's been waiting all this time, feeding on small offerings, growing stronger. And now, thanks to digital distribution, streaming services, social media, we can send its call around the world. Millions of listeners, millions of potential vessels. My blood ran cold as I finally understood. The artists, all those musicians, whose tracks we produced. Most of them are fine, Marcus said dismissively. It only takes a few to sustain it. The ones who really connect with the music, who feel it deeply, they're the ones it wants. The ones who come to their apartments at night and find their windows scratched, their ceilings leaking, their hallways suddenly endless. I thought of all the young artists who had come through our doors, passionate and trusting, unaware of what we were embedding in their music. How many? I demanded. How many people have you fed to this thing? Marcus tilted his head, considering. Directly? About a dozen over the years. But indirectly? As its influence spreads through the music, I've lost count. He crouched down in front of me, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. You weren't supposed to be one of them. You were supposed to be like me, a curator, a facilitator. But when you started asking questions about those particular frequency patterns, when you began isolating them, trying to understand their purpose, well, it took notice of you. A static sound suddenly erupted from all 7 tape recorders simultaneously, making me jump. The roots around my ankle tightened reflexively. The static gradually resolved into that familiar humming, the same pattern I'd heard in my apartment, in the hallway, in that concrete room. But now, with all 7 recorders playing, in synchrony, it was clearer, more structured. Not just humming, but words in a language that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and scratch directly at my brain. Marcus's eyes widened with excitement. It's almost time, he whispered. The convergence of all 7 channels. Do you feel it? I did feel something, a pressure in my head, a sensation like fingers probing the soft tissue of my brain. The roots around my ankle began to crawl upward, wrapping around my calf, my knee, my thigh. More tendrils emerged from between the cinder blocks, creeping across the floor toward me. In desperation, I looked around for anything that might help me escape. That's when I noticed something odd about the dust patterns on the floor. They formed perfect circles around each tape recorder, as if the dust had been pushed outward by some force. And within those circles, faint symbols were etched into the concrete, intricate patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too directly. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. These symbols, what are they? He followed my gaze and smiled that wrong smile again. Containment sigils. They keep it focused, prevent it from fully manifesting until the time is right. Until we have enough listeners, enough potential vessels. And when will that be? I asked, buying time as I spotted something potentially useful. A broken piece of metal shelving just within reach if I stretched. Marcus checked his watch. Today, actually. In about 10 minutes, our latest track drops. The one you finished mixing last week? The one with that promising young rapper? It's being released across all platforms simultaneously, with an influencer marketing campaign ready to drive millions of listeners in the first hour. It's our most potent work yet. My stomach lurched. I remembered that track, remembered how wrong it had felt, How the frequencies had given me headaches until I wore the specialized noise-canceling headphones Marcus had provided. The young artist, barely 19, had been so excited about his first major release. And what happens when it drops? I asked, fingers stretching toward the metal shard. Marcus's face contorted with religious ecstasy. Transcendence. It will finally have enough power to fully enter.